Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into the mind of a diplomat whose ideas pretty much defined the Cold War. But more than that, they offer this incredibly stark warning for our own time. His name was George F. Kennan, and his story? Well, it's a masterclass in how brilliant ideas can get dangerously, tragically misunderstood. So let's just jump right in with a question that gets to the heart of all this. Is it possible for a nation's greatest strength to also be its biggest weakness? Well, according to George Kennan, one of the most important thinkers on American foreign policy, the answer was a resounding yes. He actually believed that our idealism, our very American sense of right and wrong, was a path to disaster. So, who was this guy? George Kennan wasn't some academic tucked away in an ivory tower. No, he was a career Foreign Service officer. He was on the ground in Europe for decades, serving in both Germany and the Soviet Union. We're talking a front-row seat to the rise of Hitler and the brutal, chilling reality of Stalin's Russia. He knew the 20th century's most dangerous ideologies from the inside out. And all that first-hand experience led Kennan to develop, well, a kind of diagnosis. He was looking for a theoretical foundation, a way to explain this deep, recurring flaw he kept seeing in how America dealt with the rest of the world. He was trying to find the root cause of the problem.
And here's the diagnosis he landed on. He argued that America's whole approach to the world suffered from what he called a legalistic-moralistic tradition. Basically, we don't treat foreign policy like a complex game of chess, right? Instead, we treat it like a simple morality play, a battle between good guys and bad guys. And he thought this worldview, as noble as it sounds, was actually incredibly dangerous.
This quote right here really gets to the core of it. The moment you make foreign policy about moral judgment, you start judging other countries by how much they're like us. You just assume that everybody wants what you want and that the rules you live by should be universal. For Kennan, this is exactly where all the trouble begins. Okay, so let's really break down what this moralistic approach looks like in the real world, because it doesn't just stay an idea. It creates a very specific and often very destructive kind of foreign policy. So you've basically got two competing playbooks here. On one side, you have the moralistic approach that America tends to lean into. Foreign policy becomes a moral crusade, right? It's all about achieving total victory and judging everyone by our standards. But then you have the realist approach, the one Kennan championed. It says, forget crusades, focus on your own national security. Don't try to completely annihilate your enemy, just seek a stable balance of power. And this is key, accept that other countries and systems are just always going to operate differently. And for Kennan, this was the ultimate sin of that moralistic worldview, the obsession with total victory. It pushes every conflict to its most absolute, brutal, emotional conclusion. So instead of using force for rational, limited goals, you get something like World War I, where millions of people died in the mud for objectives that just became more and more absolute, which in the end just created even more instability.
So if a moral crusade is the wrong way to go, what was Kennan's alternative? Well, he argued for a return to a much older, more pragmatic idea, the balance of power.
And what did he mean by that? It's actually pretty simple. It's about maintaining a stable system where no single country gets so powerful it can dominate the entire Eurasian landmass. It's not about forcing everyone to be a democracy. It's just about making sure no one power can call all the shots. But why should that matter to America? Way over here, separated by two giant oceans. Well, as Kennan explained it, if one power ever came to dominate Europe or Asia, it would eventually build up a massive navy, threaten our allies, and start expanding in ways that were hostile to our own interests. Our own safety, he argued, was directly tied to keeping things in balance in the old world. And you can really see the problem play out on this timeline. Before World War I, Europe had this rough balance between a bunch of different great powers. But the two world wars just shattered that system completely. By 1945, Nazi Germany was gone, sure, but the war had left this huge power vacuum. And who filled it? One dominant continental power, the Soviet Union. The old balance was gone, and that created the central crisis of the entire Cold War. Which brings us to Kennan's most famous, and, believe me, most misunderstood idea, containment. So let's look at what he actually proposed versus what American policy ended up becoming. It's a huge difference. For Kennan, and you really have to get this, containment was not mainly a military strategy. It was political and economic. It was about making Western institutions stronger.
using economic aid, think of the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe, and applying smart political counterpressure to stop Soviet influence. It was not about gearing up for World War III.
Because you have to look at how he diagnosed the Soviet threat itself. It was super complex. Yeah, of course, there was the communist ideology, but there was also this deep historic Russian paranoia and insecurity. And on top of all that, the Stalinist regime needed an external enemy. It had to invent a capitalist menace to justify its own brutal dictatorship at home. So this was a political and psychological threat, way more than a military one.
And here's the real kicker. Far from seeing some unstoppable Red Army about to roll across Europe, Kennan saw a country that had been completely and utterly devastated by the war. He described a population that was physically and spiritually tired. He knew the Soviets were in no shape to fight another major war. Compared to the West, he concluded Russia was by far the weaker party.
So what happened? Well, Kennan's nuanced, patient, political strategy was grabbed by policymakers in Washington and twisted into this crude, militarized doctrine. Instead of careful political containment, America went all in on a massive arms race and a global military competition. It was this tragic distortion, and it was something that Kennan himself regretted for the next 50 years of his life.
But his critique goes so much further than just the Cold War. In his later years, Kennan's warnings to America became even more pointed, and honestly, they feel like they could have been written yesterday. Just look at these warnings. They're a direct shot at that legalistic-moralistic impulse he talked about. He warned us to beware of our own delusions of superiority. He told us to stop judging others by the extent to which they contrive to be like ourselves. I mean, these are warnings that echo through the really painful lessons of long interventions abroad, reminding us to understand the very real limits of our own power.
This quote is just so powerful. He basically argued that a republic has no business trying to rule over other people, taking on this paternalistic responsibility, the kind of military occupations and nation building that have proven so difficult in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, was a job he believed America was uniquely unsuited for, and one that would ultimately end up harming our own institutions. Which really just leaves us with this one big, lingering question. In a world that's still just as complex and full of conflict, have we learned any of the lessons George Kennan tried so hard to teach us? His final prescription wasn't some grand strategy or a new weapon system. It was something much, much harder to achieve. A simple call for greater humility. A call to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and that trying to remake the world in our own image might just be the most dangerous delusion of all.